We'll now look at row echelon form and reduced row echelon form, which is going to be very helpful when we're trying to find solutions of linear systems. We'll start with row echelon form, which is often abbreviated with this REF. And there are three conditions for a matrix to be in row echelon form. The first condition states that any non-zero rows are above any zero rows. So a non-zero row is any row in a matrix that has at least one entry that's a non-zero. And then a zero row would be a row with all of its entries of zero. So for row echelon form, if you have a zero row, it needs to be at the very bottom of the matrix. The second condition, the first non-zero entry, which is known as a leading entry or a pivot, in each row is in a column to the right of the first non-zero entry in the row above it. So the first non-zero entry in each row should be to the right of all of those above it. So essentially the non-zero entries should look kind of like steps going down. And then my last condition for row echelon form, all the entries in a column below a pivot are a zero. So once we find these pivots, everything below them should be zeros. While row echelon form is very helpful, we're particularly going to be interested in reduced row echelon form when we're solving systems. This is abbreviated RREF. Reduced row echelon forms are row echelon, but they have extra conditions as well. So we do have all three of these conditions satisfied and two more. The first extra condition, the first non-zero entry in each row is a 1. And finally, all entries in a column above a pivot are 0. So with row echelon form, we needed all of the entries below the pivot to be 0. In reduced row echelon, we need all of them above and below. So let's look at some examples. And I'm going to start by looking at examples that are in row echelon form, but not reduced row echelon form. Here's my first example. The first rule for row echelon form said that any 0 rows had to be at the bottom. We don't have any 0 rows here. The next one said that pivots had to be to the right of the pivot in the column before them. Here are my pivots, the first non-zero entries in each row, and we can see that they are moving down and to the right. The last condition said that everything below a pivot had to be 0, and we can see everything below the 1 is a 0, everything below the 7 is a 0, and then there's nothing below the 2. Here's another example. Once again, there's no 0 rows. We can see our pivots are moving down and to the right, and everything below all of these 1s is a 0. So this would also be in row echelon form. One more. This time we do see the row of zeros at the bottom. We see our pivots do move down and to the right, and everything below the pivots are zeros. So I've shown how all of these are in row echelon form, but not how they are not reduced row echelon form. This first one, you notice all of these pivots are not 1, so that definitely isn't in reduced row echelon form. The second one, my pivots are 1, but there's no zeros above these 1s, so that would not be in reduced row echelon form. And then the last one, I do have the zeros above the pivots, but once again, those leading entries are not 1s. Next, we'll look at some matrices that actually are in reduced row echelon form. My first example, this matrix here, we see there are no 0 rows. My leading entries do move down and to the right, and they are all 1s. And there's zeros both above and below all of these pivots. Here's another example. We see the row of zeros at the bottom. We see the pivots, the first non-zero entries, do move down and to the right, and they are all 1s. And we notice all the entries both above and below the 1s are zeros. One last example. We see the row of zeros at the bottom. The pivots do move down and to the right, and they are 1s. And everything both above and below these 1s is a 0. Next, we'll look at examples of things that are in neither one of these forms. Here's my first example, and we can see the row of zeros is not at the bottom, so this would be in neither. Here's another example of something that's in neither. We don't have a row of zeros, but if I look at those first non-zero entries, they don't move down and to the right. So this would be in neither of these forms. And finally, this example here, we see this 9 as a pivot, but the stuff below it is not a 0. So this would be in neither row echelon nor reduced row echelon form.